Hello, and welcome back to Diecast Graveyard. My name is Paul. Today we're going to go over how to clean your airbrush. Now here I have my Pache Talon, which is a double action airbrush. We're going to show you how to take it apart. We're going to show you where to concentrate on what parts you should be cleaning well or better. And then we'll go over a few other things. Now, it also depends on whether you're using urethane paints, which are lacquer based, or if you're using water-based paints. Now if you're using water-based paints, they do have Airbrush Cleaner, and if you're using the urethane paints, we're just going to use lacquer thinner to clean those out. First thing we're going to do is unscrew the handle and stop assembly. Then we're going to take off the needle retainer and pull the needle out. A lot of the times when you're cleaning your airbrush, the needle is what is the most dirty. Now you can see the paint on the end of the needle, but right there where I'm holding the needle is where the nylon bushing or the Teflon bushing seals the needle so the paint cannot leak past it. If that bushing wasn't there, the paint would leak past it and fill the whole back end of your airbrush with paint, and of course that's when you're going to have problems. So that's usually one of the first things that wear out in your airbrush is the bushing. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you here. That is where your bushing is located. Those can be replaced depending on the type of gun you have if you wear it out over time. Now I've had airbrushes that hadn't need replacing the bushing for almost 10 years, so you definitely just want to make sure that you keep it clean. We've unscrewed the needle retainer and we're taking out the rocker assembly for the trigger. Here you've got your spring, which helps keep tension on your trigger also, so you have to make sure those are clean, so you want to take them apart. Maybe put a little bit of oil inside where the spring is. This phase right here is where you're inspecting your airbrush to see what necessarily has to be clean. Now you may want to take a pipe cleaner with some fluid and run it down the center of that rocker assembly. Go ahead and take out your trigger, and then we're going to disconnect the hose. Right here, make sure it's not hooked up to your compressor because it'll start flying all over the place. Here we're going to take off the needle protector on the end, and then we're going to take off the air cap. Alright, this one's on just a little bit tight. Take you a pair of pliers. Don't dig them into the air cap there because you don't want to mar it up. Just lightly. There you go. I don't know how it got so tight, but it did. Now you're going to take off the nozzle. This nozzle tip is where obviously the paint comes out, and it also helps to seat the needle to where it's centered inside that nozzle. Now this little wrench here is going to take that off. The nozzle is also one of the parts that tends to wear out pretty fast. But what's good about these Pache airbrushes, and some good quality airbrushes, is that you can change the parts out. Now you can see where the paint's all gummed up here, but now we're going to look down the center and it looks pretty clear. But once you get some fluid in there to clean it, in this case lacquer thinner, you're going to take your needle and you're going to run it in and out of that nozzle tip, and you're going to try and get out any residue that's built all along the insides of that nozzle tip. It's actually in pretty good shape. But like I said, these nozzle tips are what wear out very, very quick. So you got to be careful. Here's your main body. That's looking pretty clean. That's got some gunk in there. We'll definitely have to clean that out. We'll get some Q-tips in there with some lacquer thinner. Now also, that little ball bearing in there, that's what controls your air pressure with your trigger. The bottom of your trigger sits right on there, and when you push on it, that's what releases the air to go past the paint to help to spray it onto your surface. We'll also want to take and put a little drop of oil on that little ball bearing in there to help lubricate the system there and the springs so the trigger moves freely. Now you can see a little bit of contamination down inside the barrel there. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a pipe cleaner, and these particular pipe cleaners have bristles on them which will help remove a lot of that residue if it happens to be stuck on. Take a little bit of lacquer thinner, or if you're using the water-based paints, use your airbrush cleaner. And again, we're going to take this pipe cleaner with the bristles built in, and we're going to run it down the chamber to help clean out some of that stuck residue. Yeah, so dip that pipe cleaner in there in the lacquer thinner. Make sure it's good and wet. And then try and run it down that chamber to get rid of that built-up paint. There we go. Now sometimes if you want to, you can soak this unit in the lacquer thinner. But the thing is that you have to know how your airbrush is made. Does it have a Teflon bearing in there, or does it have a nylon bearing in there? Now nylon bearings are going to be in your cheaper airbrushes, like your airbrushes from Harbor Freight or something like that. And eventually over time, those nylon bearings are not really chemical resistant. They're great for the acrylic paints, the water-based paints, okay? But the lacquer-based paints or your chemical-based paints and like that, this is where you want to use or have an airbrush that has a Teflon bearing because it's more chemical resistant. After you've run that pipe cleaner down there, then you want to go ahead and run your needle down through the center, and that way there, if there's anything left over inside your chamber, that needle is going to push it out. Now, take a Q-tip, soak that in some lacquer thinner, and then just start moving it around and start scrubbing on the inside of that airbrush, trying to get rid of as much residue as you possibly can. Just scrub it on the inside. See, it's getting dirty, it's getting stuff out of there. And just repeat it a few times to try and get rid of everything you possibly can. Now again, run that needle down the center. You want to be careful about this because you don't want to force that needle in there, because if you bend the needle or bend the tip, you're going to have to replace your needle. It is, though, a good practice to make sure that you have an extra needle or two, and even that needle tip to have some in standby in case something happens where you bend it or you split the nozzle, the nozzle tip there. Just have those in spare. Make sure you got plenty of Q-tips and pipe cleaners, and save an old needle too to help run down the center of that thing is good. It's the same diameter and everything, and just keep it in your toolbox instead of the side. Now we're going to take that pipe cleaner again, and we're going to run it on the inside of that nozzle tip. Sometimes that paint gets built up inside there, and you want to make sure that you're getting all that residue out of there. Now, if you absolutely have to, you can soak this nozzle tip in some paint thinner, some lacquer thinner, to help loosen that up and soften it up. While we can still see down the center of the needle, so we're doing good. Now you want to take your needle again, and you want to run it, and run the needle kind of at a little bit of an angle so you can get rid of some of that residue in there, if there is any. Just be careful, don't push too hard, because you don't want to split the end of your nozzle tip, and you don't want to bend the end of your needle. That's looking pretty good. You can see some of the residue that you are getting out of there. That's the stuff that kind of cakes along the sides. Now, I have airbrushes. I have separate airbrushes. I've got one for my acrylic paints, I've got one for my urethane-based paints, and I've also got another one for my metallics or my metal flake paints. That way there, I'm not causing any cross-contamination using your water-based paints with your urethane-based paints and like that. Sometimes they tend to have a little bit of a chemical reaction and it kind of globs all up in there and then it hardens and everything. And this way here I avoid it. Now I know everybody can't go out and get 2 or 3 or 4 airbrushes and stuff like that. So just do the best you can and be aware of what you're doing. Now I'm rubbing down the needle with the lacquer thinner, and I'm also concentrating in the area where that Teflon bushing tends to rest a lot on that needle. Now don't pull your needle back and forth too far when you're cleaning it with your cloth right there, because if you pull it too far you may accidentally pull it out of your fingers and then stab yourself in the finger. Why does that sound like the voice of experience here? There's today's tip from your Uncle Paulie. Alright, now we're going to rub the outside down because you want to try and get rid of any sticky residue no matter where it is. Now, I can get in there with some steel wool or something like that and take any additional residue off there. Just clean it as best you can. The cleaner your airbrushes, the better your unit is going to spray, which means your paint jobs are going to look that much nicer. Yeah, it's got a little bit of paint on the outside. Make sure the inside's clean. Make sure that your chamber is clean, and you'll be good to go here. Now here's my old needle, and here's my one that I currently use. Now I'm going to use the old needle to pick out any residue that I see and not take a chance of damaging the needle that I use to paint with. That's why I keep an old needle around. There you go. Alright, now we're going to put that nozzle tip back in. If I don't lose a damn thing. Don't put it in backwards. Going to put the nozzle tip back in. There we go. Make sure you don't cross thread it. Now when you tighten it up here, just finger tight. Don't smoke it down because you won't be able to get it apart again. Now we're going to take the protector cap, or the air cap, excuse me. We're going to rub that down with lacquer thinner too. Zoom in so you can see here a little bit. You got a little bit of residue on there, but we're going to go ahead and rub this down. There we go. Pardon that camera angle. Make that nice and clean. That's looking pretty good. Now we're going to put that back on the airbrush, this air cap. Now when you tighten that up, again, just finger tight. Don't smoke it down. Now here is the needle protector cap. All this does is protect your needle from getting bent or crashing it into your surface if you happen to be getting too close to what you're painting. Now it does have a tendency to build up paint, so you may have to soak it or scrape it down with a razor or something like that and get rid of that paint as best you can. Now the Q-tip with the lacquer thinner on it will get rid of a lot of it, but again, sometimes you may have to soak it down to get rid of that residue on there, and then rub it down or use your little razor knife here and scrape off any excess paint. Sometimes it'll take a few minutes to get that stuff on there if you haven't addressed it in a while. So it's best to try and clean it up as best you can when you're done painting for the day or the evening or whatever. Now if you absolutely have to, unscrew it and then put it in a small cup with some paint thinner in it and let it soak overnight, and it should come out really easy. That's starting to look awesome. Just don't stab yourself in the finger. Tip number 2 from your Uncle Paulie. There you go. That's looking pretty good. Now guys, if you have any questions about airbrushes and things like that, I've been airbrushing about 30 years. I was living down here in Florida, painting t-shirts for the tourists and stuff like that. I also had a freelance job where I was an instructor at Airbrush Getaways for Airbrush Action magazine. And I met a lot of friends along the way and learned a lot of things. So I'm pretty well versed in airbrushes. Now, you don't want to get oil in the front of your airbrush. Now I'm just going to put a little bit of lubrication here on that spring that controls the air where your trigger rests. And you might want to put just a little tiny bit around where your needle is going to meet your nylon or your Teflon bushing. And just a little tiny bit. You don't want to get it up around the needle, because if you do that, it'll get into your paint and it'll contaminate your paint, and you're going to have blotches all over the place where your paint and your oil are sprayed onto your car, and you're not going to be able to get a good paint job. Here we'll take our rocker assembly, we'll put the spring back on. Might want to rub a light coat of oil on that. Put your housing on and your needle retainer and slightly screw that together. Make sure your trigger is resting on the air valve. Put your rocker assembly in. Make sure that the tip comes outside of the slot there. Hold it backwards with your trigger and then screw it in. There you go. You'll feel it go forward. That's excellent right there. There you go. Now we're going to take our needle, rub it down one more time with some lacquer thinner in case there's any residue on there that we missed. Now they do have special oils that you can buy for your airbrush, and I'll research that and I'll bring it up in one of the next videos. I just didn't happen to have it with me right now. But it tends to not react with your paint. You just don't want to saturate your needle. I'm putting a little bit of oil right around where the Teflon bearing is going to be, and then the back end of the needle. Just rub away any excess and anything that's forward of where your bearing's going to be. Feed that into the back of your needle holding assembly. There you go. Make sure it's all the way forward. Hold it with your finger and then tighten it up. Don't smoke this down, because if you do, you're going to have a hell of a time getting this thing apart. Trust me on this one, okay? Put your handle back on. Test everything out. There you go. Your airbrush is now clean. Again, folks, if you have any questions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I'll be happy to answer anything for you. Now, you're going to go ahead and put your hose on. If I don't drop it again. Finger tight only. Just make sure it's not leaking air. And you're going to put a little bit of lacquer thinner inside the reservoir to flush away any oil or any other residue that might still be loose inside the gun. And again, the most important thing here is that you're going to flush out any of the oil that you may have gotten on your needle. That way there, when you go to put paint through your gun, it's not contaminated with oil. That's looking pretty good. Please leave any questions you have in the comments. And like I said, I read them all. And if I've got an answer for you, then I will get back with you with the answer. And hey, thanks for joining me here today on how to clean your airbrush. Thank you for joining me today on Diecast Graveyard. We've got a lot more videos coming up in the future, so go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And thank you again for joining me here today. If there's something you'd like to see, put it in the comments. Thank you, and cheers.